I'll just continue from where I left off yesterday. So the time came for us to go to India again, and that became my third time meeting Baba. And as I mentioned yesterday, my parents had wanted to change the date of Dara and Amrit's wedding from December of 1968 to the following summer, but Baba said, no, it's now or never. And I remember at the time, my dad said to my mum, you write, you ask. Because, who wants to ask Baba to change his mind or change his plans? So my poor mum had to write. And she got a bit of a stern response. No, it's now or not at all. So that was that. So we couldn't go for very long. So we went in, I would say, the beginning of December, and maybe a little bit later. Whenever my school broke up, I wasn't allowed to take any time off school, and we got 2 weeks, I think, for the Christmas holiday in England back then, and then we had to come back straight after. So we had no idea we were seeing Baba for the last time, and also seeing him before he dropped the body, only a few weeks after we returned to England. So there was great anticipation, again, just like when I went when I was 7. But it was, of course, to see Baba again, to see the mandali, to see the ladies. As I mentioned yesterday, I'd had so many letter exchanges with Baba and with my aunts, got to know my aunts better through correspondence, but also Dara and Amrit's wedding. I mean, this was huge and so exciting, and I'm sure many of you have heard the stories directly from Dara and Amrit. I mean, they're wonderful storytellers, and their wedding was amazing. So again, for me, and I have to apologize, these are very self-referential stories, but, I was a child. I really only saw Baba and my relationship with him. So once again, I was just so excited to be going back. Well, my father spoke to me again and said, now look, this is different. Baba isn't well. That we'd been hearing that he had been in failing health. He said, you cannot hug him. You cannot jump on his lap. All the stuff he'd said to me when I was 7. And I was a bit, more mature, and I understood he wasn't well. And I was like, yes, Daddy, I'll be careful. So it was the exact same scenario. We arrived in India, we were greeted by Sarosh and all the cars, and it was all just so wonderful and welcoming. And the day of anticipation, the anticipation I felt for the day that we would drive to Meherzad to see Baba again, to see my aunties again, and to meet Amrit, who became my sister-in-law. We'd never met her. So we drove to Meherzad. Baba sent his car. I think I mentioned yesterday, I just loved seeing that sign, private road. It felt like you were entering another realm. And the road was so long. It wasn't, but it felt so long to me. And this time, I can't swear to this, but we met Baba in his room, which was to me a bit of a sign that, he wasn't well. Selfishly, I really liked the fact that we were in his room because, as I mentioned, I loved his room. It was pink. I just loved it. I loved being in there. And I loved sitting on the bed with him. So the same thing happened. My dad, I had the garland. My dad said, don't throw yourself on him. Exactly the same thing happened. Baba opened his arms. I ran to him. I dropped the garland, I'm sure, and gave him a really big hug. And he had a beaming smile. And I really got a telling off from my father that time afterwards. He said, you can't do that again. But I did it every single time that I saw Baba. So, immediately to say, there was a very noticeable difference in Baba. He clearly wasn't well, but I was not mature enough to really understand how ill he was, perhaps. He was as sweet as ever, beaming smile. He rested more. Definitely I couldn't pester him as much. And, for myself, I wasn't the center of his attention on this trip. I was to a great extent. He was so sweet. But, there was a wedding that, wasn't about me. So, and we weren't there for as long. So everything felt very condensed and concentrated and a little bit hectic. We met Amrit, that was just I was so excited because I really wanted my brother to marry. I wanted a sister in the house. I wanted them to have children immediately. So I'd have my babies. I was a little obsessed with babies. I mean, I was just so excited. We had the same arrangement. My mum and I stayed with her parents. My father was with Baba. And I mentioned my father had gone to see Baba when Baba was in seclusion that summer, it must have been that summer, to talk about the wedding, to make all the arrangements, that you do for a wedding. So I'm not very good now at remembering the chronology, but quite a lot happened during that visit that was personal to me. And, of course, this incredible, beautiful wedding. So just jumping ahead to the wedding itself, it was at Meher's. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen the film. And a lot of the family were up there on the veranda with Baba. And then there were all the guests, all the guests assembled. And Amrit looked so beautiful and so nervous. And my brother looked nervous. And I felt so much, this sort of welling up for him. And it was so sweet and so moving. And then Baba came, and it was just incredible. And, the ceremony happened, and lots of kisses, and, little gifts were given, and everyone was hugging Baba. And I definitely felt a little left out. Because, like I say, I wasn't cute, I wasn't 7 anymore, and this visit was not remotely about me. But almost every time I felt a little bit, Baba's not paying attention to me, he would lean back or lean forward and make eye contact with me. Every time I felt sad. And, it's silly now to say I felt sad, but, I did. I was a child. And he always... And I know he did that with everyone, and he managed to do it with everyone all at the same time. But he did do that. So I always felt that he was still a little bit interested in me. And he was, he had time, despite the wedding, he had time to talk, and we'd sit and chat. And he asked me more about my school. That visit for me, quite a few things happened. And 2 very meaningful exchanges happened with Baba. 2, maybe 3. And again, I'm a little bit all over the map with this. So I still, despite everything, and knowing that Baba wasn't well, and knowing that there was this wedding, I still, thoughtlessly went to his room uninvited. So I would just show up. And one time we were sitting and we were talking about, I don't know, all sorts of things, school, my friends, and Erich or somebody must have been in the room. I don't remember anyone else in the room. And I think Baba had been asking me about my friends and how it was going at school. And I asked him, Baba, when can I take the bus to school? So in England, we don't have school buses like you do here. My friends were taking public transport to this school that Kitty Davey had gone to. And my parents, at age 11, very understandably, didn't want me taking the bus, but my friends were taking the bus. And as I said, I can't overstate it. We didn't make a decision that did not involve Baba's approval or going to Baba and asking him. So my parents had said, no, you can't take the bus. So I said, Baba, they won't let me take the bus. And he said, you can take the bus when you're 13. So that was when I was allowed to take the bus. So I felt that was reasonable. I was happy with that. So we were just talking, maybe playing some games. And he looked at me and, very deeply looked into my eyes and said, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact words, but he said, I do remember them, but he said, what do you think is the most important thing you can do for me? And that's a big question, and to ask an 11-year-old. And I was taken aback, and I thought about it, and I thought, well, I was raised to love you and to obey you. And then I thought, well, loving you is easy. So I felt my answer should be to obey you. I said, to obey you, Baba. And I'll never forget the look in his face. He sort of slightly shook his head, and he said, no. He said, no. Not in that way. I just shouted it out. He said, no, I want you to be happy. And even at that age, I had the sense to know that this was quite an astonishing thing for him to have said to me. And I was so moved, I was so touched by it. And there was a part of me that thought, oh good, Baba's going to mean I have a happy life. I thought he'd sprinkle fairy dust on me. Well, that, and as we all know, that's not how it works. But it was very, very moving to me. And then he gave me a few orders. He gave lots of people orders. And quite a few to me, not too many. And I think it was during this visit when I was 11. I don't think it was when I was 7. But he told me I wasn't allowed to read any of his books. And he meant his books that he wrote. I'm allowed to read books about him. And I didn't, thankfully I didn't question it or ask him why or say, oh, please, can I read your books? Because, the irony is I'd love to read his books. I know there are people who would rather do anything than read God Speaks. I'd love to read God Speaks, But I can't. And, ironically, he had my father read God Speaks 7 times in the space of about 3 weeks, I think. But so he gave me that order, and, I didn't ask him why, obviously. And, I say obviously because apparently I wasn't above, when I was 7, I did question him a little bit. So our days would go by, this real flurry of activity about the wedding, then the concern that Baba was himself quite ill, and then probably a lot of Amrit was ill. She had a fever, and so she wasn't 100% for her wedding. I remember the first part of the wedding was at Vilu Villa. Perhaps that was the legal part of it. So for myself, when I met Baba when I was 7, I think when one is that age, you're just so innocent, and your mind is just so empty in some ways, and there's no artifice, and you're not questioning yourself. There's a big difference between 7 and 11, and I got to experience that. So at the age of 11, I was much more, I don't remotely mean that I understood anything about Baba, but I was more conscious of who he was. I really was. Oh my goodness, this is my uncle, he's God. It was a lot for me to process at that age. I also, I'd grown. I was very aware of the fact that Baba knew absolutely everything I was thinking. And I'd learned some swear words. And I thought, he's going to know, these were very mild, benign English swear words, but I thought he's going to know that I know swear words. And I was also self-conscious about myself because, however silly this might sound, so when I was 7, I was just as cute as a little button. I was petite. My mum dressed me up like some kind of a doll. She just loved to do that. I had this long hair. She'd wind it. And by the time I was 11, I started to develop what in England we used to call puppy fat. It wasn't my best look. And my mum still dressed me up in those outfits. So in advance of the wedding, she'd made me these, she'd crocheted me. It was the 60s. She crocheted me like a lurex dress that I was bulging out of. I remember this so well, and I had sort of lurex tights and silver shoes with a bow. And my hair was still up, and I had the little tiaras. So, except it wasn't it wasn't very cute looking, at that point. And but my mum was so happy and so wanted me to be all dressed up for Baba. We always dressed to the nines whenever we saw Baba. So there's footage of me at Dara Numrit's wedding looking miserable, in this get-up. But I'm mentioning that because I just was overall more self-conscious to be meeting Baba, and I suppose there was the kernel of that thought, how on earth can I be his niece? Those little questions that you start to have. But I never asked him. I never asked him that. So, along with, all the flurry of the wedding preparations, still, Baba loved to be entertained. You all know that, right? You've read all the books by all the Mandali people, who used to tell jokes, sing, dance, So after my sad little offering when I was 7, which was singing all things bright and beautiful off-key in Mandali Hall, I had a plan of how I would entertain Baba. But unfortunately, my mother also had a plan. So shortly after we returned from seeing Baba when I was 7, after we returned to England, my mum knew that Mera loved ballet. And because of that, she thought I should take ballet lessons. And she asked Mera, should Shireen take ballet lessons? And Mera said, oh, yes. Well, that's it. Once you've done it, once you've asked, that's it. So Margaret Krask, who you all know of, I'm sure, she was a very dear family friend of ours, and she was a wonderful, prima ballerina. My mum consulted her, and she said, well, Shireen should wait until she's 8 or 9 because the bones are forming or have formed, and that's when she should start. So that was right around when my puppy fat decided to come. So I'm doing ballet, feeling very ungainly, bigger than all my classmates, and I did not take to it. Sorry for all the dancers. So I loved to watch it. So I was painstakingly taking these lessons, and I was truly, truly dreadful. So my mum was meanwhile getting worked up because as the time approached to go to India, she knew what she wanted me to do for Baba, perform. And she told Mera. And I was just begging my mum to stop the lessons. And she said, no, Mera auntie wants you to do this, so this is what's going to happen. So I became increasingly more ungainly, less able to follow the choreography, to the point where my teacher, who was really nice, said to my mum, she said, Mrs. Irani, I can't do anything with Shireen. Because my mum had meanwhile told her, I want my daughter to perform for our family in India. And so my teacher said, look, I'll give her private lessons on a Saturday. Which is, the last thing I wanted. I wanted to play with my friends. And instead I have to do these lessons. So I don't know, it came about, Mum must have written to Mera, and Mera must have said, oh, yes. So it was expected and planned that I should dance for Baba. And I can't really overstate what I was like. It was a sad, I love to dance, but not that. So it was I was just feeling mortified even before I got to India. And the dance do you know the Tarantella? Do you know that? And I think there are variations, but the dance, I don't know, she's some little sprite or some kind of wood nymph, or maybe a human, I don't know, who is in love, maybe she's in love, and she's bitten by a tarantula, and she suddenly, she starts to go mad from the bite, and I have to sort of do all this frenetic dancing, and I had to have a rose between my teeth. And I had this outfit that looked awful on me because I was not this delicate ballerina. So it was just, everything about it was just painful for me, So the dreadful day came when I had to do this performance. And, unfortunately, Baba wasn't feeling very well that day, so it wasn't even to be done in Mandali Hall where there's space. I could have gone far away or something. No, it was in his bedroom, which there's no room in his bedroom. And yeah, and of course all the Mandali crowded in, you know. So in those days we had some little portable cassette of the music. I mean, I might be misremembering some of the aspects of the dance, but I remember I had to wear a little apron, little scarf in my hair. Very cute, you know, cute look, not on me. And so the time came and I was praying. I was actually standing in front of Baba, looking at him, praying to him silently, please, Baba, make this stop. Please, please, please. So then, great news, the tape recorder didn't work. And I thought, oh, you know, thank you, Baba. And I was sort of preparing to take off my outfit, and Auntie Mera said, don't worry, we'll clap in time. So I didn't even have music, I had nothing. It was me in my outfit with this sort of uneven clapping, me kind of galumphing every step. Was, you know, the room shook. You know, when you're self-conscious, you know how everything is exaggerated. So I'm, you know, plonking around Baba's bed, and then have to end by twirling in a froth of madness. And I think I ended up on the floor with this rose between my teeth. And I, you know, it was, and of course Baba was, oh, that's so lovely, lovely. So he was so sweet, and I was just, well, I was mortified, obviously. And then I don't remember if it was before or afterwards, but if you've seen the film footage of Dara Namrat's wedding, one of Vilu's, I think her granddaughter, do you remember the little girl dancing for Baba? She's beautiful, she's petite, she's elegant, she's doing all of her lovely dancing. And I don't know if it was before or after. I have a scowl on my face, that entire, I mean, it's terrible. And I'm sort of sitting there in this very ungainly way. And I remember looking at her thinking, why couldn't I have danced like that for Baba? So, but I had my kind of counterpoint because, and of course I'm talking about my stories here, but tell you about the wedding and all, but the one thing I knew I could do was tell jokes. I was quite good at delivering jokes. So this was 1968. So back then in England, there was an Irish comic called Dave Allen. I don't think anyone would have heard of him. Oh yeah, we talked about that, Ellie, yeah. And he was really popular. He had a weekly show. I mean, he had different iterations of shows, but he was very, very popular. Really a great, suave, droll, hysterically funny Irish guy. So he had the Dave Allen show, and we used to watch it every week as a family. And part of his sort of MO, I suppose, was that he was very anti-religious, anti-God, anti-religion, specifically the Catholic Church. So, you know, we would watch this. My dad would love it, like really laugh uproariously. Dave Allen had an ongoing skit where the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope would be in their respective carriages and they'd be jousting. I mean, you know, the church did not like this man. But we loved him, and he would end the program. So he had skits and he'd tell jokes, and he'd end the program by saying, "Good night, and may your God go with you." And my dad loved that. And he also, he must have done something to his finger, but he had a glass of whiskey. He was always in a suit, you know, very, very, like I say, very debonair and droll. And he said he lost his finger from stirring his whiskey, because he'd stir the whiskey. So he told some great jokes. And I remember as a family when we'd watch, you know, my dad would laugh and say, "Oh, you know, good thing Baba's not hearing these jokes." I mean, even though he knew Baba had such a sense of humor. So, you know, after the debacle of my dance, I thought, well, I've got one, you know, card up my sleeve. I'll tell some jokes. So, I don't know, it was in Mundley Hall, I think, and I just must have piped up, you know, "Baba, can I tell you some jokes?" And I really do remember my dad little twitching, little like wondering, what is she going to say? And so I told Baba 3 Dave Allen jokes. And Baba laughed so much. He was so sweet. And it was such, for me, it was such a sort of redemption after my absolutely appalling, attempt at entertaining him. And he was so sweet. He asked me to tell him the jokes again and again and again. It was just so great. And then this, too, it's a little bit like with Mrs. Munro, my high mistress. So we heard that Dave Allen was actually excommunicated from the Catholic Church. But I haven't been able to find that. But we heard that at the time, and I always wanted to write to him. He died a long time ago, and say, maybe the church excommunicated you, but Meher Baba, Avatar of the Age, liked your jokes, So, I don't remember if this happened before or after Dara Namrat's wedding, and this is partly my memory and partly what Anvaz, you all know who Anvaz was, what she saw. So Baba called Amrit and me, Amrit being my sister-in-law, my new sister-in-law, and he called us both to him and had us kneel before him. And then he held us against his chest and had us embrace each other and him. And I don't actually remember this part of it, but apparently it lasted a very, very long time. And he told us that we are now sisters. And years later, when Jay and I went, after our marriage, Anavaz, we spent a lot of time with her, and she said, I saw that. I went into I was at the door frame, and I saw that, and she said her heart sank a little bit because she felt that long embrace was giving us courage because we might not have a very easy life, and she was concerned for us in that way. But that was very moving. I don't think we saw Baba as often as we had done the first time. Again, it was only 2 weeks perhaps, and so much with the wedding. And the wedding was a very joyous affair, and you've all seen the film. The twins sang their songs, and they did their little skits, I think. And then, you've seen how Baba's wheeled off, and that curtain, and he says goodbye. So I'll just quickly tell you, if you like. So Baba had given me a few orders. So when I was very young, I had this very long hair that I didn't appreciate, and actually it used to drive my mum mad, having to brush it, and there were knots, and I'd start making a fuss. So when I was 7, I think, when we were in India, I asked Baba if I could cut my hair. Or I asked my mum, and she said, you have to ask Baba, and he said no. So when my father was in India with Baba in 1968, I was a pest. I said to my dad, please ask Baba if I can cut my hair. Because by then, I was at school. I was, again, a little self-conscious. I was the only girl with hair down to my thigh, And so a postcard came from my dad, and it was so exciting. He said, Baba says you can cut your hair. And I was really happy, 8 inches, which on my hair was a trim, a barely noticeable trim. So when we went to India in 1968, looking back, what on earth possessed me to trouble Baba with this? But I did. I asked him again about my hair. And my mum said, talk to Mera Auntie. So my mum, Mera, and I spoke. And my mum said, ask Mera Auntie, which is what I called Mera, to ask Baba because he will listen to her. So, yeah, she did ask, and she put it very nicely. She said, it's very hard for Franey, and Shireen and Franey get into these arguments. And Baba, can Shireen cut her hair? So he said yes. So, I got the message, and immediately my heart sank. I thought, oh, why did I ask that? And the message, moreover, was we must have been at my grandmother's when the message came, or maybe we were at Meherazad, Baba said, but you've got to do it now. So we went back to my grandparents. They had this big, big balcony. And my mum put my hair into a big, big plait and just jump. Oh, and Baba had said it had to be shoulder length. So then got the message that we had to go back to Meherazad so Baba could see my hair. By this time, I was in tears. I felt, ridiculous for having pestered him, for having asked such a completely irrelevant, there was this wedding. I mean, I just felt so awkward and embarrassed to have troubled him with this. So he called me back and he, made some nice gestures and comments, and he said, yes, it looks very nice. And then he put his hand under my hair and he said, no shorter. So I've stuck to that, of course, I've stuck to that order. And then another time, again, it's sort of for me as an adult, I'm more than an adult at this point, but looking back, what was going through my mind to just, pester Baba. So when I was 7, I wanted to climb up Seclusion Hill, and he said, no. And he said, you're frightened of snakes, there are snakes up there, you're frightened of heights. No. So that became a big deal for me. So when we went back when I was 11, I, didn't have the common sense to just leave it, and I asked Baba, can I climb Seclusion Hill? And Baba said no. So I went to Mera. And big mistake. So I went to Mera and she asked Baba, and so Baba said yes. So either before or after the wedding, a group of us went up, and it was a lot. There were just lots of people who went up. I think maybe Erich was there, a lot of the men Mandali. So for whatever reason, and this is not my fault, this is my mum's, but she dressed me in the most inappropriate, I was wearing a little skirt and sandals, and I had a fluffy cardigan. I wasn't even wearing trousers. And off we went. Well, I don't know, halfway through, a quarter of the way through, I looked down. So I'm frightened of heights, I'm frightened of snakes. And I looked down and I realized I couldn't do this. I couldn't go up. And so my father said, okay, we're going down. And I said, we can't go down, I can't. So the upshot was that I had a complete fit on Seclusion Hill. I became very hysterical, very fearful. I created a scene. I sort of twirled in my anxiety. And I landed in, I remember it being cactus. I don't know if it was cactus, but it was something with lots and lots of thorns. So I was just a disaster at this point. And, I was also very embarrassed because I knew well enough that I'd spoiled the outing. Everyone was having to pay attention to me. I was kicking and screaming, and I think my father or somebody else had to carry me down. So that was how I behaved after I'd pestered Baba to climb his hill. So I felt, again, mortified. So I remember we went back to Meherazad, and I was carried into, there's a little side room when you go into Meherazad. At least there was then. There was a bed. So I was placed on the bed, and I remember my cardigan was full of these spines, these thorns, and then Money and Goher and maybe Mera came in with tweezers and pulled them out of me. So I was red, crying, covered in these things like a porcupine, feeling miserable because I knew I'd let Baba down. So then, of course, someone came in and said, Shireen, Baba wants to know how you like climbing his hill. So I, composed myself, and I went in very sheepishly, and of course Baba was beaming, as he so often, I know he has done in this sort of situation. And he embraced me, and he said, did you like climbing the hill, was it? And I just said, yes, Baba, it was very nice. So we learned later, and I'm trying to picture how this could be the case, but I guess you can see the hill from from Meherazad, Baba had asked Mera or Mani to take binoculars to see how my climb was going. And so he would ask, he would ask, how's it going? What's Shireen doing? So it was, well, Shireen's screaming, Shireen's fallen into some kind of a bush. Shireen has to be carried down. But he didn't mention any of that, But I learned later. So I don't know, it's tempting to think there are some lessons. I have no idea. I was 11. I don't know what the purpose of all that was. But I remember later, Mera, Mani told us, she said, be careful what you ask Baba. If you don't want the answer, don't ask him. And it was even a little bit the same with Mera. She'd say sometimes, don't ask her. And then, because then otherwise, you're sort of tied to it. So Amrit and Dara got married, and was it on Mera's birthday or was that their engagement? So the big celebrations for the wedding, for Mera's birthday. It was very, very beautiful. And then the time came to leave. And, it was just so sad. But I was also very excited because we were coming back. Dara and Amrit came to live at our house, Manzil. Once they were married, they came back to live with us. I was 11, and Amrit was only 18. We were really, in so many ways, just kids together, And I was so happy, she was coming home. I had my sister, but we had to say goodbye to Baba, and I think we all went in privately. And when it was my turn to say goodbye to him, he was very loving, he was very sweet. He said all the things you'd expect him to say, don't worry, take my name, think of me. And I said, Baba, when we left, I said, Baba, I wish I could stay at Meherazad with you. And he said, next time you can stay at Meherazad. And also, during that visit, my parents had asked Baba if when the time came for me to marry, could I marry at Meherazad? And Baba had said yes, which is how my aunties came to organize our wedding, which is 45 years today was the reception that we had. And our wedding day is tomorrow. Yeah, Jay's sister was there, quite a few members of Jay's family were there. So, it was very sad saying to Baba, of course, I was crying, and he said all these wonderful, comforting things. And I was very sad, but I was also excited because we were going home with, this new family. I mean, Dara had lived with us all along, but Amrit, like I said. But when we got on the plane, this is more something my mother remembers, but I burst into tears and was inconsolable apparently, and was really sobbing, and it was a little embarrassing for my parents. And my mum was like, shh, what is the matter? And so I said, I'll never see Baba again. So that I guess I had the common sense to realize he was very ill at that point. But having said that, I don't know that anyone really knew that it would happen so quickly. And he said his next darshan would be reclining and all of that, yeah. So we went back to England, and I don't remember the date, but it was either late December or early January, because I had to go back to school. And then we got the absolutely unthinkable news. Jay, have I forgotten anything from the visit? From the actual visit? Okay. So we're home, Dara and Amrit were adjusting to their new life. I was back in school. I told you the story about Donkin and how that transpired, that his sister paid my school fees. No, that was when I was 7. Yeah, that was when I was 7. So we got the call, and it was IDK, and in those days, it was sort of a big deal to get a call from India. And I remember my father picked up the phone, and I remember, I think I was asleep, possibly. Perhaps it was, I'm trying to think of the timing, but I seem to recall I was in bed. And I heard my father talking very, very loudly and then crying, sobbing. And I'd hardly heard my father sob. And I could hear what was being said, which was that Baba had dropped his body. And thinking, no, that can't happen, that's not true. And I might have even gone back to sleep. So then my dad called us all, Dara, Amrit, my mum, me, we all met in the sitting room, and he told us. And, it was unbelievable. And especially, I suppose for a child, I just couldn't take it in. So then time went by, and my mum said, well, we better get you ready for school. And I said, no, I'm not going to school. I just thought the world was going to end somehow, and that it couldn't possibly continue. So I thought everything that is normal, everything we've known, it's finished. And my father said, no, you're going to school. So I did, and I remember talking to Dara, and we were all crying, and I had misunderstood what Baba had said, that it was after they had 2 children they could go back to India. And I somehow thought that meant that Baba shouldn't drop his body until they'd had their 2 children. I was very confused, and Dara explained that's not what Baba said. So then the big flurry started, getting my father to India for the entombment. And it was all like that, it just had to happen so quickly. And I don't know how much time, because I want to tell the Silence Day story. Okay. Yeah. So it's a really wonderful story for our family. I'll just tell you quickly. So my dad, he was like, his whole impetus was just go to India, which he did do, I think, that day. So you all know who Delia Dilian was. Some of you might have met her. She was our very beloved friend. She and my father met, when my father was 17. And she was a huge part of our life in England. And in fact, when we left England, what broke my heart was leaving Delia, because we brought my mum with us. So Delia was amazing and wonderful and very special. She had a reputation for being a little bit of a fusspot and not a spontaneous person. And she and my father loved each other very much, but they'd have the most incredible arguments. And he just, sometimes it was a bit much for him. And she used to call him Ardy. I was Ardy. And she was very dramatic. And she's an amazing person. So I will say that the last person my father would have wanted to travel with him to the entombment was Delia. However much he loved her. And he loved her very much. But he just wanted to go and do what he had to do. Delia, again, not spontaneous, took weeks to organize anything, absolute weeks. She never did anything at the spur of the moment. So my mom was preparing to send my father off to India, and I'm not sure if my mom had already dropped my father at the airport. I'm not sure. Anyway, she got a phone call from Delia, and Delia said, I must go to India. And my mum said, okay, Delia, when the time comes. No, I'm going now. And Mum said, but Delia, this is so last minute. You don't do this kind of thing. She said, no, I'm going now. So Delia in those days, she didn't have cash on her. Anyway, one of my mother's brothers was a pilot for Air India. And my mum said, Delia, don't worry, I will help you. I will help you go to India today. So whether she went with my Delia to the airport, she might have driven her. She spoke to the Air India counter and said, my brother, Captain Faradun Irani is an Air India pilot. I am vouching for this woman. Let her get on the plane. And it was really that dramatic. Meanwhile, my father's gone off. And in those days, or maybe now too, I don't know, in those days, he took a bus to the plane. So he's on this big bus on his way to India, And my mum engineered it so that Delia could go. So my dad's on the bus. I mean, my father told this story, and it was hysterically funny. We were screaming with laughter, but I can't really do it justice. So they're on the bus, and suddenly the bus stops. And they're all thinking, oh, why is the plane's over there? Why has the bus stopped? Doors open, and there's Delia, resplendent in her. She used to wear fur coats, and she was something else. She always had this perfectly coiffed sort of purple hair, white purple. She often used to wear these stoles, the animal stoles with the feet and the claw. She was a remarkable person. We really loved her, and she was fully ready in this kind of, she used to love to wear 4711, which is this perfume. She was in this kind of haze, and she's on the bus. And my father, who was, in shock and grief, he could not believe that of all people, Delia was there. So, of course, they sit together and they're on the plane. And when my dad, it really lightened the mood when he came back from India, and he was still so sad, but he told this story and we all just laughed uproariously. So she was his companion, on the bus, on the plane, on the drive to Naga, and it was just a lot for him. But it's so sweet because I don't know if any of you have read Delia's book, The Ocean of Love, which is exquisite. And I had the real privilege of helping her write it, and we'd go through all her notes. So in her book, she tells a story with a slightly different bent, and she sort of, saved Adi. She saved him by going with him. He had a slightly different version. But he said later on, if she hadn't been with him, distracting him, he would have been broken, and she did actually help him make that next step. And it's very moving because I think this is true, it must be, it's in her book. Delia was the only Western, of the Western women, is that right, Jay? To be with Baba for the entombment. And she was the last person you'd ever think could do that journey. And Baba, she found out that Baba said to one of the Mandali, Delia will be with me at the end. So she fulfilled that. Oh, and her family, because Delia never did anything like this, she just wrote a note to her family and left it somewhere, gone to India. So, of course, her family were phoning up my mum saying, what's happened to Delia? And anyway, so that was a very sad, life-changing time, obviously. Our lives changed completely. Baba was no longer in the body. And two really sweet things happened. And I think everyone, who was there at the time, not everyone, but so many people have these moments of consolation where Baba showed himself and gave solace. So in the case of our family, so my dad was there, I'm not sure for how long, and just when he was leaving, I think he must have been there just for the 7 days, because Baba was there for 7 days with different garlands on his body. So on the last day, my dad said, I think he said to Erich, I would love to take a garland back with me. And Erich said, just take it now. So my dad traveled back with his very fragile garland that had been on Baba's body. So he brought it back, and we all looked at it, and obviously we were very moved. And my mum said, Adi, but how on earth are we going to preserve this? This is so sacred. And now we have it, and what do we do with it? So if any of you have heard of the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew, where Baba spent a lot of time, and actually Delian lived opposite those gardens, and we had the great joy of living above her for 4 years. So we were very in close proximity to Kew Gardens. It's an amazing, amazing place. So my dad thought, well, I'll take it to Kew Gardens. And the Kew Gardens is, by the way, the Royal Botanical Gardens, because I think even now it's technically owned by the Queen. So that was his thought, and he thought Baba has been there, he's walked there, he walked the length of the gardens. So he went with the garland, and he got an appointment and spoke to this very nice man, told him, just said to him, could you preserve this? And this man said, well, actually, Mr. Rani, I agreed to meet you, but the fact is, we don't do anything like this for the public. This is the Royal Botanical Gardens. We only do what falls into our brief, as a Royal Botanical Gardens. So my father was, a little bit disappointed, but he understood. So he got up to leave, he was about to leave. And then the man called him back and he said, Mr. Rani, he said, I don't know the story, but I feel this garland was on someone very special and I'm going to do this for you. So he did do the preservation of the garland, and then we got it back, and my father was an antiques dealer, I think I mentioned that, so he had some old frame, and my mum spent a long time with Amrit's help, stretching velvet, and then my mum pinned the garland on very carefully, and she embroidered some of the symbols from the Mastery and Servitude. So that's the garland we've always prayed to. And it's remained, they used a special kind of glass, and the garland was preserved in that way. And that was very comforting. And then another thing that was just so perfect, when we were in India, I suppose it was for Dar and Amrit's wedding. I suppose it was then. Could have been. No, it was then. No? When my dad went, when Baba was in seclusion just before the wedding, Baba asked Rano gaily, not Baba, my father asked Rano gaily if she would please paint a Mastery and Servitude emblem for our family. And she said, of course. And they really liked each other. So she did that. And she painted it and, took the huge leap of faith and actually sent it to us in the post rather than through a Baba lover. So, that's miracle enough. And it arrived, I think, the day or the day after Baba dropped his body. So we were devastated, and then we opened this. And later, Rano told my dad, she said, I almost didn't send that to you, because she said when she was painting it, and she's painted many of them, but Baba had never before spent so much time saying, change that color a little, make that color deeper, and he touched each of the symbols. And she said, I didn't want to send it to you after that, but she wanted to keep her promise. So that was very wonderful. In our home, yeah. All of that came with us, obviously. I could talk a little bit about the London days when all the young Baba lovers came, but I did want to, if there's time, and I'm happy to stop whenever I should, but tell you our Silence Day story, because that was really something. But just quickly, after Baba dropped his body, there was just this hole, that we and everyone felt. We just didn't know what to do with ourselves. So my parents felt it would be nice to hold monthly Baba meetings. So the old guard came, meaning Delia Dillian, Fred Marks, Tom and Dorothy Hopkinson. The Backetts, I think, had died. Will and Mary Backett, they were Baba's archangels. They died. So a lot of the old, as I say, the old guard, but then there was this sudden, as Delia Dillian referred to them in her book, the vanguard, the new Baba lovers in England, many of whom were in London and some of whom came elsewhere. So it was a very interesting time. And it was a very interesting time for me because I was this sort of, I was this 11-year-old, and all these people were in our house. I really had two lives, I think, growing up. My sort of Baba life and then my outer life with school and my friends. So the Baba lovers would come, and one of the most memorable meetings was Pete Townsend. Most of you, I'm sure, know he is a Baba follower, and also Ronnie Lane, who was a member of the Small Faces, and then the Faces with Rod Stewart. Ronnie Lane came first, and I think he introduced Pete to Baba. So Pete Townsend came, which was, a big deal for us. I remember Dara was really excited. I was a little too young. I love The Who. Of course, it didn't take me long, but I was a little too young to really be into The Who. And I think I was telling some people, but I thought, it was John Lennon coming. I was just, a Beatle. So anyway, Pete came, and of course, what could you say about him and The Who? And he played O Parvadigar acoustically at our house, and I think it was the first time he played it publicly, and it was just incredible. I mean, my father, no one spoke. It was just remarkable. So that was a very wonderful memory, and actually he doesn't remember that, because when my mum went to Baba, Pete and I exchanged some emails, and I said, "Do you remember?" And he said, "Well, I don't, but I'm happy to think or to know that that's what happened." So those meetings lasted for about a year, and then they kind of dissolved away. But we met many long-lasting friends, and then right after those ended, then we had the American invasion, because in those days, and I mean, quite a few of you are here who were part of that. Maybe it wasn't the case with you, Tim, specifically, but for many Baba lovers who came through our house, in those days it was cheaper to go to India, to fly to India from America via London, with a stop in London. So I don't know how many people we had staying with us. My mum always said she wished she kept a guest book. Countless people came through Manzil en route to India. It was kind of a stepping stone. So we met many of our very dear friends, came to us that way. Jay came to us that way. Jay and I met when I was 13 and he was 18, I think. That was the first time we met. And, Heather and Eric, and I mean, people that you'd know. So again, it was such an exciting time for me. And it was quite extraordinary. Our house was a big house. And my parents just would sort of shove people, because of course everyone was a hippie back then. No one had a plan. No one wanted to spend any money. So they come and stay with us. And my mum fed 3 meals a day. I mean, she looked after and everyone. And like I said yesterday, my parents didn't have money, but they just felt strongly they should do this. And they were very generous, incredibly generous. And, some of those people we never heard from again. Some of them became good friends and husband. So they just felt this was, they never really even spoke about it. They just felt it was something they should do. We had some truly eccentric characters who came and stayed. My father had to usher a few people out. It's like, no, you can't stay here anymore. Bob Brown came. You all know Bob Brown, and he didn't want to leave, and he didn't leave, and he stayed for weeks. And did I ask somebody? He composed "Victory Unto Thee," didn't he? I think so. Well, he composed that at our house. I would hear him singing, and he was so sweet. But he only wanted to be with my father. And my dad would say, "Bob, please go and do some sightseeing. You're in London. Go and look at the Tower of London, something." And he didn't want to. He didn't want to leave. He was very sweet and very attached. So I don't remember a day when there was no one, when there wasn't somebody else in our house. It was a huge part of my growing up. And as the years went by, and I met more and more Baba lovers, I learned about the centre at Myrtle Beach, and my parents were so closely connected to Kitty and Margaret specifically, and Elizabeth and Jane. And so I went to the centre when I was 16. So now I think I'd like to tell you, if you'd all like, since if this is a Silence Day Sahavas, really an amazing story that happened. And I really like this story because for me, it's a little bit like my going to that school, St. Paul's Girls' School, and wondering why would Baba bother so much? And then I could, my feeling is deeply that it made Kitty Davies so happy, and that's why I went to that school. So in this instance, it's all to do with Mera. So when we were planning our wedding, and I, had the great privilege and joy of planning our wedding with Mera, Mani, Meru, Katie, Goher, and my cousin Gulnar, the twins' sister. So all these letters back and forth, back and forth. And it was mostly between Mani and me, and sometimes Mera. When I say Mera, I think Meru did the writing for her. But all the plans, and of course, just all the things we had to think about. So the first request I had, and I think, Jay was part of this, but I wanted to marry on the 7th day of the 7th month, which is what we did. And they agreed to that. And then I wrote, I think to my Aunt Mani, I said, and could we marry at 7 in the morning? Because I thought 7. And she wrote back and said, absolutely not. No one will be there. You can marry on the 7th day of the 7th month. So fairly close to our departure and the plans. And by the way, we married legally in England, and then we married in the Samadhi on the 7th of July, and that's what we consider our wedding. Mera wrote and said, do you really want to marry on the 7th of July? It's very close to Silence Day. And, we'd always kept silence in my family, always. And she said, how will you manage this? Because you want to go on honeymoon. And I wrote back and said, oh, no, it'll be fine. Thank you, but we'll be fine. It'll all work out nicely. And I think she wrote again, she said, are you sure you will keep silence? And I wrote and said, oh, absolutely. That's not a problem. So we married on the 7th of July, and, Tara was there. And on the 6th of July, we had our reception, which was so wonderful. I mean, it was so great. And that was at Merazad. And there was music, and the twins and their lovely friend, Bejan, I think, did this hilarious skit where one of them dressed up as me, and it was basically us and our life story, including the birth of our daughter, which hadn't happened at that point. And we were like, what will Mera? And she said, and she was laughing away. It was very funny. So our reception was so wonderful. And, we've talked about this. It was especially wonderful because it was almost like, in the best possible way imaginable, we were guests at our own wedding. It wasn't about us. It was about Mera and Baba. But we were blessed, to have that occasion. So then at the Samadhi, the next day, it was really, it was our families and the Mandali. And we exchanged our vows, and it was very simple. And then we came out, and then our taxi came, and our taxi that broke down 7 times on the way to Pune, where the driver was getting out and suctioning with his mouth, whatever he was doing, I don't know. So and it was pouring with rain. And so Mera, as she said goodbye to me, Mera said to me, Shireen, are you sure you will keep silence? And at this point, I thought, this is serious. I mean, we had every intention of keeping silence, but I began to think something might happen where we can't. So I said, yes, Maranti, I promise you we'll keep silence. So, it was so silly of us to have chosen the 7th of July in light of Silence Day. So we got to Pune late. We met my Uncle Jal at the station. We took a train to Bombay, and we flew, I think, the next day or 2 days later to Singapore, where my pilot uncle was living, and spent the night with him on our way to Bali, and we left for Bali on Silence Day. So my uncle hosted us on the night of the 9th, and then said to us, I won't be here tomorrow, I'm flying a plane. So we were in his flat, didn't know a soul, had no way of communicating with the taxi. He said, I will arrange your taxi. But, we didn't have a way of phoning them to confirm, is this really happening? We were just totally on faith. So we're alone in his flat, wake up on Silence Day, and then it dawned on us, we've made a mistake. And the taxi came, so that was good. So we had our little notes. Jay had written out all these notes. I'm sure some of you have done this. We can speak, but we're keeping silence. Just about everyone treated us as though we couldn't speak and we couldn't hear. So we were flashing our cards. It didn't mean anything. So I was already starting to feel a little anxious about this and really remembering Mera's words. So we got on our plane. Well, it's about the longest flight in the world. I think we had to change planes, but we were on this plane. It was interminable, and we were silent. And this is our honeymoon. And I tell you, by the time we got off, I was like, I am going to divorce you. How dare you put me through this? I was the one who insisted on this. It was like awful. We couldn't even argue with each other. It's like I was pinching him. So frustrated, I was fit to scream. So we had to change planes somewhere. And then we crossed the international date line. There was something where the Silence Day was extended. It was even longer. So we were, exhausted and disheveled. And, I, of course, was thinking, Mera Auntie really knew what she was talking about. So we finally arrived at our airport, fit to be tied. I mean, we weren't speaking to each other, and it was Silence Day. It was like, and we of course had mountains of luggage, and we were just overwhelmed, And it was really hot. The airport was. This was 45 years ago. It was like a little shack, and everything was just too much. And of course, we'd arrived so much later because I think our flight was delayed, and all this time because we had. That's right. I said to Mera, we will keep silence until midnight at our destination, which just kept getting pushed back and back and back because of this time change. So we were just feeling pretty fed up, but I suppose we were just grateful that we'd arrived. There were all these people queuing up. We had to get our bags on this conveyor belt to go through customs, I suppose. And suddenly, out of nowhere, this man appeared. And did he have a sign, Jay? I think he might have had a sign with our name. And he was kind of doing this. And he called our names. And we were just so a bit shell-shocked. Looked at him, and he said, in fairly decent English, that he had come from so-and-so hotel. And we looked at him like he was mad because we had put, in those days, so Bali's, it was close enough to sort of India and Singapore that we could afford it, I suppose, as our honeymoon. And there's this one beach, Sanur Beach, and it really was back then. The really nice hotels were here, and the really dumpy hotels were here, and that's where we were booked, obviously. And I thought, wow, I was young. I was 22, but I knew enough that this was nice, that our grotty hotel sent someone to pick us up. So, we sort of, and he said, I've come from so-and-so hotel. He helped us through, he kind of got us to the front of the queue somehow, right? And it was all starting to look very nice. And we relaxed a little bit. And then he took us out, and it was so humid and just teeming with traffic. And there was this big American car. What was it, Jay? Cadillac. Yeah. Completely incongruous where we landed. There was no other vehicle like that. It was, tuk-tuks and whatever kind of car. So there's this big monstrosity, and he's gently ushered us. And we thought, this is really good treatment, for this cheap hotel. So we got in, and he drove us to our hotel, and it was very late by then. It was maybe 11 o'clock, 10:30 or 11, local time. So then he showed us this sort of almost like an outdoor tiki bar. He said, tomorrow you can check in there properly, but and he got the keys to our room. There was no one there. and he let us into our room, and he showed us around. So we were really relaxing at this point. You know, we were speaking to each other internally. That was good. And then he said, do you want something to eat? And we were, you know, of course we were silent. We were, yes, please. So he produced sandwiches and something to drink. And we really were relaxing. And it was just so nice. And then midnight, and we broke silence. You know, we thanked Baba. And that was that. So the next day, we wanted to thank this man. We wanted to maybe give him a tip. We wanted to just find him and say thank you so much. So we went to check in. And when we went to check in, we really did, it was a kind of, the hotel, it was a beautiful, beautiful surroundings, but it really was a bit of a dump. And we, we said, it was a father and son operation, and we said, thank you so much for sending your driver. It was really hard for us. I had written to them, oh, that's right, I had said to them, we will be observing a day of religious silence. And they looked at us and, I said, you sent the driver last night and that was so kind of you. And they said, no, we don't have a driver. We don't send a driver. And so I persisted a bit. I said, no, you sent this man and he did this and he did that. And he said, no. So at that point he thought we were a little odd. So we thought, well, that's strange, but okay, we'll go and find the driver. We'll do this somehow. So we spent a few days asking people on the beach, asking taxi drivers, describing him, describing the car. And it really became very obvious that this man didn't exist. And, I know a lot of Baba followers have wonderful stories like this. Often people are blessed to have these kind of, amazing sort of supernatural stories. It honestly doesn't happen to us much. I mean, I think for me it was the cherries and Baba getting me through my exams, and that basically it. So this was, anyway, as I say, it dawned on us that this was Baba. Baba had sent someone. Well, the other thing that Mera had asked me to do, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this, as she was saying goodbye to us, she said, send me a cable letting me know, so this is very important, send me a cable letting me know you've kept silence. So it was really then that I started to feel a little bit nervous and thought, oh dear, something's happening. This is very important. And so we did. We sent her a cable, and I remember the wording, I worded it, by Baba's grace and your prayers, we kept silence. And so, we talked about it, and it was this kind of amazing story, and what a great way to start our honeymoon. And again, for both of us, it was just this overwhelming sense of how much Baba loved Mera, and Mera wanted us to be silent. We had been foolish in our planning. It wasn't about us at all. It was about Mera. She wanted to hear we'd kept silence, and Baba made it possible, because I was ready to burst. If that man hadn't shown up, I was, I don't think I could have done it anymore. So that was very wonderful. And you're going to England on Sunday. Good luck. Yeah. So I think I'll end there, if that's okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Jai Baba.